Hi, my name's Andy Rourke. I'm the designer of coalitions. In our first video, we talked about how I came up with the idea for coalitions, and now I want to take that a bit further and showing how we started to develop the game. I come up with this win-win mechanic that I wanted to use. I wanted it to be a Napoleonic game and grand strategy. I wanted it to be up to 6 players, but I wanted there to be no special rules. So whichever the player count, the rules are always the same. I wanted there to be no dice, and I wanted really to try and avoid a card-driven game. I didn't want the choices to be driven by what cards you've drawn. So I wanted to take as much luck out of the game as possible and make it all down to what choices a person made, how well they did. Not to do with dice rolls, not to do with what cards they've drawn. So the first thing I needed to do was think about what's the game going to look like. So the first thing I did was started by making a board. I don't have any Photoshop skills or Illustrator, so the board was going to have to be made from card. A question of just cutting up coloured paper and getting it to represent what I wanted. Being a Napoleonic game, the board really was always going to need to be a map of Europe. And the representation I wanted to achieve was roughly the sort of situation at the start of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, about 1792. I didn't want it to be particularly accurate because with a lot of board games driven on maps, you end up with all the action happening in a very small area, whereas I wanted the game to be functional, the map to be functional. So I deliberately distorted the map to make areas where I knew there'd be a lot of play as big as possible, and areas where there perhaps be less play could be less important and smaller. Once I got a rough map made, I then needed to divide it into regions or territories. Again, this didn't need to be too detailed, it didn't have to be too accurate. It's only a prototype. I'm just trying to work out how the game's going to work, how the mechanics work. So, the detail of where a border lies is irrelevant at the moment and can all be adjusted later on in the development of the map. So on top of the card prototype, I just dotted on lines where I thought regions and territories could be, and separated the nations that I wanted by colour. One nation, particularly Britain, I wanted to reflect its influence in different places. So Hanover, in Naples, and in Portugal. Doesn't mean that they were controlled by Britain, but Britain had influence there. That was the idea, the premise that I was thinking of to start with. Once I'd created the board, I needed to think about how I could make the game feel Napoleonic and also use this win-win mechanic I wanted to use. Now, the great attraction about the Napoleonic period is the tactical interplay between the infantry, artillery, and cavalry. Each arm is dependent on the other for support to be able to overcome the third. No one arm is totally devastating to the other. So it's always about the interaction of these 3 elements, and that's what makes Napoleonic warfare so interesting. I wanted to reflect that in gameplay, so I wanted a kind of triad of actions. So in most games, you have movement from territory to territory, so I wanted to include that. That was one aspect. And then we're going to need to have a combat or contest of some sort. That's the second action. But what could be the third action that I could bring into this triad to make the win-win mechanic work? And after creating the thought, I came up with this idea of strength, or what I decided to call political determination, which hopefully was going to reflect the kind of diplomatic dealing between the nations. And this political determination, this strength, would then be used to fight in contests. So if one army wanted to move, you would have to ask somebody else to allow it to move diplomatically, which would gain their political determination, which later on they could use in a fight against the army that's moved. So every time you move, you're making your opponent potentially stronger in the contest. So this is the kind of 3 factors that I wanted to bring in. So then I decided to work out how I could do that on the board. So going back to the board, I decided to place some armies into locations where I thought to be suitable for start positions. I wanted to place some numerical values into territories to try and reflect the worth of controlling or holding those territories. And I thought I was going to need some sort of scale, which I added to the side of the board, which was going to represent the nation's strength or political determination. So the armies would have a strength, and the nation controlling the army would have a value of political determination. And when it came to combats, the combination of the army strength and the political determination added would be the strongest one would result in winning the contest. That was my initial thoughts. Now I had my basic board and I had my win-win mechanic. I had some ideas of where I wanted to place armies. I had territories with values, and I had a political determination scale. I now needed to develop some rules and start to balance these values out that I'd allocated to the various territories. In my next video, I'm going to start talking about developing the rules. So if you're interested in game design, please subscribe to the channel, and please feel free to follow me on Facebook at Form Square Games. Thanks for watching.